right, let's get going. So thank you everybody for attending our launch event for Who Writers Read. Who Writers Read is a salon where writers discuss their reading lives. So we're going to have a conversation with our guests, and at the end they'll read a bit from their recent work. My name is Ginger Eager and I'm one of your hosts.
And I'm the other host. I'm Jodie Forrester, and Ginger and I have put a lot of months and months and hours and minutes even into planning how this is going to work. We're very excited because so many of the Zoom events that we ourselves attend are more specifically about writers reading from their work, but to talk about books and what books have influenced them and what their reading life is like is something that we are particularly curious about and never have the opportunity to really find that out. So that's what we're looking forward to this. And thank you so much for being here. It's our launch event, and hopefully there won't be any glitches, but if there are, we'll be patient with ourselves. Let's see, we hope to have a little time. Wait, did you say this already, Ginger? We'll have to have a little time at the end, yeah. And we'll also upvote. Okay, so I'm gonna let Ginger introduce our guest.
Okay, if you have any questions, there's a question and answer box at the bottom and you can upvote other people's questions. So I'm going to introduce our guests. In the top square, we have Deborah A. Lott. She's the author of the tragic comic memoir, Don't Go Crazy Without Me. See my notes? As well as the book In Session, The Bond Between Women and Their Therapists. She teaches literature and creative writing at Antioch University, Los Angeles. Her creative nonfiction has been published in numerous publications, including the Alaska Quarterly Review, the Bellingham Review, Cimarron Review, Black Warrior Review, Story Quarterly, The Nervous Breakdown, Salon, Tin House Online, The Rumpus, Scoundrel Time, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. Her essays have been thrice named as notables by Best American Essays. In our third window, we have Ellen Prentiss Campbell. Her fiction explores the way history and chance, work, and the people we love shape our lives. Her debut novel, The Bowl with Gold Seams, received the National Indie Excellence Award for Historical Fiction. Her new novel, Frida's Song, is inspired by renowned psychiatrist Frida Fromm-Reichmann, who fled Nazi Germany in 1935 and spent the rest of her life working at the Chestnut Lodge Sanatorium in Maryland. Campbell's collection of stories, Contents Under Pressure, was nominated for the National Book Award. Her second collection, Known by Heart, appeared in 2020. Her short fiction has been recognized by the Pushcart Press. She's a reviewer and columnist for the Washington Independent Review of Books and a contributing editor at the Fiction Writers Review. She practiced psychotherapy for many years before becoming a writer.
So we'd like to start with some questions that we intend to actually ask each of our guests. In particular, we want to start in your past. What sort of influences were you exposed to initially? What was the literary environment of your home as a child? How did that environment contribute to your becoming a writer?
Well,
I'm sorry. This is for both of you. Ellen, take it away.
Okay, and then just get the hook, when it's time. I can't separate reading and writing. For me, I just feel like I've always been a reader, though of course I couldn't always have been a reader, and I've always been a writer. And I love to read. There's a Stephen Sondheim song in his kind of strange but wonderful musical Passion. And it says, I live to read. And I think actually that's kind of true of me. But when I was a child, I loved to really get lost in what I was reading and become what I was reading. So that when I was reading Alice in Wonderland, I actually felt as though I was becoming Alice in Wonderland. And that's such a similar experience for me now as a writer. If I'm on, I can feel as though I'm becoming the character who I'm writing. So I loved that. And I loved books that played with time and history, I think. There's a wonderful book called Hitty, Her First 100 Years, which is old now. I think it was written like 1935, but it's about a wooden doll who over 100 years travels the world. And I think it was a very preparatory reading experience for me. And there's something about this doll, you know, like a kid who is so unable to be active, so unable to be an agent, but goes everywhere and experiences everything. I loved that book. And then I'm going to stop with this because I want to know more about Deborah's childhood reading, but I loved and still love Charlotte's Web. And I think it's partly because it's so true about life and death. And I had an experience last summer, and I just have to share this because this was a pandemic book that I read last summer to review it, actually. But it is such a fabulous book, and I feel like it got lost in the pandemic. And I just want to say to everyone, if as a child or as an adult, you still resonate with Charlotte's Web, please read Beneficence by Meredith Hall. See, I've got my friends with me. This is Beneficence by Meredith Hall. She wrote a memoir, but this is her first novel, and it's about a Maine farming family. And I won't say anything more, but it's absolutely super. And right from my childhood reading to Charlotte's Web, the two connect.
Well, and thinking about this, what I really remember is the rhythm of language, that was the first thing that made an impression on me. My dad was the lay rabbi at our little community temple in La Crescenta where there were no Jews, which is part of the story in my book. But I remember hearing him read from the prayer book and reading from the Torah, and just how the rhythms of language would just infuse me. And then I read a lot of poetry as a kid. Robert Louis Stevenson, I read that Garden of something.
Verses.
Garden
of Verse over and over and over and over and over again. And sometimes those poems still will come back to me all of a sudden. You know, I had a little shadow that went in and out with me. And what could be the use of it was more than I could see. So poetry was really important to me. And I started out really writing poetry. It took me a while to come to prose. I mean, I always kept a journal, but it's really the language, the rhythm of language that's kind of first and foremost for me.
The language in your memoir is beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah, it is. And I'm wondering, did any of those books in particular come to mind? Well, at some point, what point, I mean, you were starting to write poetry very early on. Was there a point that you realized while you were reading these books that I want to do this too?
I think I started writing really, really young, because I remember writing before I could actually write, and I would dictate stories and my mom would write them down for me. And I think it was more that sense of being an outsider, that feeling that you're the observer, like on the playground at school. I remember the other kids would be playing, I would feel excluded from their games, and I didn't want to get hit with a ball, God forbid, or the tether ball would hit me in the head and I'd die, because my father had told me that. So I would be on the sidelines writing a little story in my head, and then I would go home and recite it and my mom would write it down. So I think I always thought of myself as a writer.
That's so true for me too, Deborah. That's so interesting, because when I was a child, my father was a teacher, my mother was a teacher, and before I could read or write, they would let me, after they had read me a story, let me dictate to them each night the best thing or the worst thing that had happened that day. And I've kept a diary ever since, but I really credit that experience, I think, with giving me a sense that you could put what happened to you into words, and it would give you a handle both to hold on to something precious and to lift something painful. And so I, like you, I think I always thought of myself as a writing being. Mm-hmm. And I, like you, Deborah, kept diaries and journals, and I was reading through some of them last summer, the quiet of the pandemic. I was up in the attic, and when I was 11, I boldly said, I will have a book published next year. And there was such confidence in that voice. And I was like, well, whatever happened to that? Why did it take you 50 years?
Exactly.
But isn't that interesting how true that is? And the rhythm of language and hearing poetry. My paternal grandfather was a preacher, and I did not know him well, but his family had a custom of memorizing poetry. They were very poor farmers, and they would have speaking nights. And so there was such a tradition of spoken poetry that I heard about more from his youngest sister. And I just think you're right. The cadence of poetry is so much part of what makes you a writer.
Ellen,
Absolutely.
so I don't know if this is something you particularly want to talk about, but I'm curious, why did 50 years pass? Was it just you were doing other things? Was it lack of confidence?
Yeah, you know, I think I had an incredibly fortunate year, the year I was 11, in that I had a teacher who was such a mentor and such a creative spirit. And so I think she just infused great confidence in me. And then I think that year was followed for me by the not uncommon experience of being just sort of out of place with junior high school and out of sorts with myself. And so I kept writing my diary, I kept writing stories, I kept writing poems, but it was nothing that was really fostered or shareable with the community around me. And when I went on in school again, you know, in high school, in college, I did have some opportunities to write, both, you know, obviously the obvious ones, but, and I've written an essay about this. I think there was a way for me that kind of the corners were getting knocked off and the brightness of my confidence was getting knocked off during those years. And that's not unusual. I think it happens. And so honestly, then for me, although I kept writing and reading constantly, the dream of being a writer stopped really being my dream. And I became engaged with life, which was satisfying in lots of ways. I loved my work as a social worker and a psychotherapist, and I was listening to stories all the time. And I loved my work as a parent and a family member, but there was no opportunity, or I made no opportunity to write. There's a line Wallace Stegner says, it's hard to take notes when you're going over Niagara Falls in a barrel.
That's good. Well, thank you for sharing that.
What happened?
And it happens to women too. I mean, I have drawers and drawers and drawers of writing. And I published a little bit of poetry in my 30s. Then I finally wrote my first research-based book in my 40s. But it took a long, I mean, one rejection and I would feel very rejected. And you don't have role models. I think as a woman writer, up until more recently, we didn't have a lot of role models. I mean, I remember in college at UCLA, my undergraduate as an English major, we read a few women writers and they were mostly seen in terms of their pathology. I mean, we read Sylvia Plath and it was like, oh, let's see about this poor, sick, crazy woman who killed herself. So the role, you need a role model. You need to see that it's possible to start doing it. I mean, I'm looking at some of the writing I did in my 30s now and going, why didn't I try to publish? This is pretty damn good.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So I want to jump to another question, and this time let's start with Deborah. The reason we're here today is specifically we want to know about what you're reading today and what is the relationship now between your reading life and the books that you're reading. Are you writing in response to something? And what served as your inspiration essentially?
I really want to talk about Bernard Cooper first, because I think that he isn't read as much as he should be now. And he was my first teacher of memoir. And that was the first time I looked at memoir and thought, this can really be art. This isn't just autobiography. This can really be an art form. And what I got out of him, part of what I got was how to make the ordinary extraordinary, how to take a sensory detail, slow down a moment, allow the details to expand in a way that you kind of slip into the surreal, which he does over and over and over again. So in his piece, Arson, I don't know if anybody's read it. It's one of the essays in Truth Serum. It's about an adolescent, a gay adolescent who's burning all his pornography because he doesn't want to be gay and he doesn't want his family to know that he's gay. So he's taken all his magazines down to the family garage and he's going to burn them. He sets them on fire. And then there are these wonderful moments where pieces of the men's bodies are floating up on the wall and onto his body. I just want to read one little quote from him. The first scrap of anatomy was a man's arm. It fluttered down like a molted feather, part of a picture singed at the edges. Legs and shoulders and buttocks came next. The magazines were burning to pieces and pieces lifted on sudden updrafts were raining everywhere. I swiped at the stifling air, trying to catch a couple of muscles. That's the kind of writing that I want to approach in writing memoir. I mean, fearless, so embodied in the physical world, and yet a little bit beyond reality. So I think he was my first and strongest influence, and still is. I always go back to him looking for courage when I'm afraid of violating some taboo. And just for the beauty of his language, I mean, the power of his verbs, just in another piece he wrote called Burls, which is an essay about a young boy who's out at a coffee shop with his parents and suddenly sees drag queens walking down the street, and it changes his whole view of reality. But he talks about the waitresses in the coffee shop, and he says, from their breast pockets frothed white lace handkerchiefs. Just that verb frothed, and just the power of the verb.
Wow.
He was probably my first and strongest influence.
It's so interesting.
You know his writing. Sorry, Ginger, go on.
Well, it's so interesting to hear you say that too, because one of the things that struck me a lot in your work was how you handled the body. I mean, the bodies are so real. Your father's body is so real. Your body is so real. Your mother's body is so real. And there's that opening section where you're in the bed between your parents and your mom has sort of, cast you aside and gotten out of bed. And you're playing with your dad's body and he has that mole and you're poking his mole and he's making a raspberry noise. It's so real and so embodied. And I thought of it when you read the section from Bernard Cooper, leaping to catch the pieces of the men.
Yeah. I mean, he really gave me the courage to go into the body. I mean, another writer today that does that really well is Lydia Yuknovich, who's kind of revolutionized a lot of women's writing, I think.
I agree.
Well, I've also been a huge fan of Bernard Cooper's, but I have to tell you, what you've achieved with Don't Go Crazy Without Me is definitely of a caliber that you can obviously completely internalize what lessons or perhaps what wisdom he had to share, because you're a raw writer.
I think I'm a raw woman. Raw and raw.
And you don't shy away. I mean, I know it can take many drafts to keep going through the layers and be more honest in the next one and the next one and this one, but it's something that I really, when I first read, the first time I read your memoir, I was a little taken aback at how intimate you brought the reader into a part of your life that I didn't feel like I was probably supposed to be privy to. But then the second time I read it, I was just in awe, truly in awe.
Oh, thank you, John.
So Ellen, did you have anything to say about?
What I was thinking, partly in response to Deborah's remarks, is it's really interesting to me how as a reader, I have read differently now that I am actively writing all the time. I mean, it's still completely possible to read just for pure pleasure and I do. But even reading just for pure pleasure, I feel like there's a way in which now I'm always looking a little bit for, how is this being done? You know, what's going on with this? But in terms of my own reading experience right now too, I would say, you know, for those of us lucky enough to come through the pandemic alive and well, there's also been an opportunity to sort of pull in. And I feel like my reading experience has been really rich and really intense over the past year, partly because of the isolation of the pandemic. Something that happened to me is I've always said I would never be in a reading group. I would never be in a book group. I don't want to be in a book group. I don't want anyone telling me what to read. I'm going to read what I want to read. Well, on a public space, right at the beginning of the pandemic, on Twitter, they offered an online book group reading War and Peace. And I, as it happened, had never read War and Peace. And I thought, well, I don't have to really read with them, but I can read with, it was so wonderful to be just reading with completely anonymous people, but reading people's responses and seeing how things evoke different things from people. And so part of that experience led me for the first time to think about the possibility that reading with others would be something I would want to do again in a certain way. And so in this small co-op building I live in, I and another resident reached out to people and said, you know, we're not seeing each other, but would you want to read together? And we selected Middlemarch, and we started reading Middlemarch, you know, week after week, and coming together to talk about it. And I loved hearing the different perspectives on that book. And I loved also feeling that for me, even though I had read that, of course, as an English major in college, it was so different reading it now, both as a woman who is old and as a writer. And it was such a rich experience. And then Ginger and I have talked and tussled with this before. You know, Ginger knows, and it's true of my work, that I'm very interested in speaking what's unspoken, and maybe speaking for people who don't necessarily have a voice, but are not necessarily the hot populations that we view as not having voices. You know, so often I'm writing about elderly people. And so something that I've been reading recently that I'm loving is George Saunders' book, and it's Swimming in a Pond in the Rain, in which 4 Russians give a master class on writing. And so what he's done, and I'm not crazy about every single passage in it, but what he does is it's a really close reading of short stories by 4 of the great Russian short story writers. But I love what he says about what these writers are doing. And he says, you know, this is resistance literature. And that just made me sit up and take notice, because I feel like we underestimate the classics. You know, for example, how radical is it that George Eliot, now I'm reading Daniel Deronda for the first time, how radical is it that she was doing what she was doing? Pretty far out. So George Saunders says of Gogol, Turgenev, Chekhov, Tolstoy, the resistance in the stories is quiet, at a slant, and comes from perhaps the most radical idea of all, that every human being is worthy of attention, and that the origins of every good and evil capability of the universal may be found by observing a single and very humble person and the turnings of his or her mind. And I just really think that's got a truth in it that's so beautiful and goes beyond, just goes way beyond the moment. So that's something I'm reading right now, and I'm really loving it. And I'm also really loving Daniel Deronda. And it is really, it is a passionate, difficult book, and I'm loving it.
Yeah, I love Daniel
That's
Durant, and
phenomenal.
I'm reading Saunders right now too, the same book.
Oh, Ginger, wonderful.
And the same could be said of your work, Ellen. I mean, absolutely, you could have read that for your own work. Your characters, as you said, are quiet and aren't generally, wouldn't be assumed to be marginalized characters, but they are for various reasons. They're single mothers and they're in small towns, and they maybe aren't terrifically affluent, or they're older and they're falling in love. And
Or they're a woman doctor and a Jew and
doctor
refugee.
Yes, yes. And you also handle the body so well. I have to say, the opening scene or the opening chapter where she is talking about the affair that she had, where the doctor is talking about the affair that she had with her student and how he taught her the meaning of pleasure. Oh gosh, it's beautiful. It's in the 30s, right?
Well, that student of hers
It's Eric.
was Eric Fromm.
Mm.
And again, you know, these are just my imagined, you know, Frida from Reichman and Eric Fromm. But yeah, absolutely. That was them.
So I have, go ahead, Deborah.
Oh, I was
So
just
I
gonna
was
say-
just going to say another writer that made me think about of Sigrid Nunez, who I think has been underappreciated until pretty recently. And just like reading The Friend, I don't know, have you all read The
I
Friend?
haven't read. I'm
Read
writing
it.
it down.
Read The Friend, read The Friend.
Oh,
And I think what I learned from her is how important voice is, because you don't read her to find out what's going to happen. There's not a lot of plot. It's what smart thing is she going to say next? So The Friend is about a writer whose friend, who's also a writer, who was her mentor, has committed suicide, and she's inherited his Great Dane from the third wife, who just didn't want the dog anymore. And so she's going through the grieving process as she falls in love with this dog. And somehow in this framework, which I mean, doesn't sound very dramatic, she's able to talk about everything, about grief, about what it means to be about a writer, about the nature of friendship. And she makes it all feel like she's just talking to you. I mean, some of it is posed as a letter to this friend who committed suicide. But it all feels so easy. You think, how do you make it feel that easy to talk about Wittgenstein and Rapunzel, Edith Piaf, Rilke, Wittgenstein, Kafka, George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life, Joy Williams. I just like wrote down some of her references where she just weaves it all in. And then it's all really about her and this dog. So it's
Which
an
I love.
amazing,
I
it's an
love.
amazing book. She's an amazing, and she's quiet. Like you were saying, Ellen, she's quiet where you might think, well, she's just talking about ordinary people's lives. Who cares? But she makes you care so much. And I have one quote from her I just wanted to share. She said, "It is curious how the act of writing leads to confession, not that it doesn't also lead to lying your head off." I like, because I think through memoir, no, Jody, we memoirists, that's our secret, that we don't say we lie, but the process certainly can lead to invention. Let's say
make
invention.
things up.
Of
That's why
course.
I'm going to stick with fiction.
The one thing, Deborah, I was fascinated. There was a review that I read in Goodreads about your book, and it compared your story to Moby Dick. Do you see similarities between that classic?
You know what I think they were talking about? So there's a chapter in my book where my teenage narrator, who's reading Moby Dick for her high school class, finds it incredibly arousing and masters Moby Dick. So I think that's where I think that's what the illusion is.
Well,
I don't think it's that the book is really about like Moby Dick, but that I found Moby Dick very inspiring in a certain way.
another book for fantasy.
So one of the things, One of the things.
So what are you guys reading these days? What do you recommend? You both have recommended 2 books. I put them in the chat section. Is there anything else that you're reading? Is there anything else that you want to either direct the people to?
I would recommend that people read Later by Paul Osicki too, who was another one. He was another one of my memoirs. He's written, I think 4 or 5 memoirs, but Later is really about being in Provincetown during the AIDS pandemic in the 1980s and what it meant to still be sexual and still claim your body when every act of sex could be a threat on your life and where you're watching young men dying all around you. And it's an extraordinary book. So that's one that I just read recently. I just started reading Luster. And now I can't remember the name of the author, Leilani.
All of a sudden, the chat section isn't allowing me to write these books down. So I hope that other people are writing them down.
We'll put them all in our bookshop. All the
Yeah.
titles mentioned, we'll put on.
There
the
we go.
bookshop
That's
store.
what we'll
That would be
do.
wonderful.
But yeah, Luster, I just took a class with Garth Greenwell on how to write about sex. Which I highly recommend his book too, Cleanness.
Yeah.
But you might need a cold shower afterwards. It's pretty hot. But yeah, he just did a seminar on how to write about sex, which I thought was really fascinating because we don't, and women have shied away from writing about sex. And I think we need to. We can't have all the sex be written by people like Updike and D.H. Lawrence. We need to be writing about sex from a woman's point of view.
In
And I bet
my
he
memoir,
taught a workshop because he was the moderator when On a Public Space was reading Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin.
Wow, right.
And it was a really interesting book, and he was a really good moderator.
Greenwell is that what you said, Ellen?
Greenwald,
Garth Greenwell.
Garth Greenwald, and his latest book is Cleanness.
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah, I know in my memoir, I ended up writing, it was critical to the memoir about my own sexuality and both the suppression and the emergence. And it was really hard because so much about my sexuality was not truly healthy. I mean, a lot of it was, I grew up in the 60s and that's like free love and you meet a guy and you fuck him and you're supposed to be some kind of an amazing connection, but in truth, it was just like fucking. And women, especially at that age, girls really, we wanted more. We wanted to be held, we wanted to be cared for. And the guy was like, okay, I got off, I'm gone. And to know how to understand ourselves sexually does require us to write, I believe, very, very deeply and not just shy away.
And your book is so good, Jody, and really showing that kind of intersection of the political and the sexual in the 60s and how we were sort of fed this line about what it meant that to be political was also to have free sex. And there were good things about that. And there were terrible things about that. And a lot of the leaders of the movement were these guys who were just charismatic men, right?
And
taking advantage.
There's nothing new under the sun, because again, look at Daniel Deronda, where George Eliot put herself beyond the pale with her choice. And she writes so exquisitely from inside both women's bodies and men's bodies. And she's writing at a time where, and she's being serialized in the newspapers. So she doesn't have the freedom that we have if we choose it to be very direct, but she's writing so exquisitely from within the body. Like there are pages where Daniel Deronda is rowing on the Thames. And I'm just, my jaw is just dropping. How did she know how this felt and how she's getting it on the page? So who knows what she would do now, but she is so fascinating to see what she's doing with that. So interesting to see what she's doing with that. Or, again, very differently, and this is something that Ginger and I probably have talked about before too, although I am an embodied writer and an embodied person, and I don't shy away from that, but I also believe, and I feel like there's examples all around us, that there is so much rich, deep sexuality in literature that expresses it with a different vocabulary of restraint. You know, I'm thinking again, even of having just read Go Tell It on the Mountain, which I had never read before.
Mm.
And I mean, it's just a marvel of expressing sexual tension, but expressing it in such a really fascinating way, I think. You know, that's one of, so I think there's a lot of interesting models out there, and that this is an ongoing struggle. I think it's probably always been a struggle. Look at Liz.
I was just going to say, and the Brontes, I mean, Wuthering Heights is such a hot book, and Jane Eyre, which I teach nearly every year. And my students, it's like a Rorschach for students, like every book is, I guess. But I love Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, and I mean, and again, it's a sexuality that can't be talked about directly. So it comes out in all kinds of interesting euphemistic ways and metaphorical ways and symbolic ways. But you know, nevertheless, you feel it in your body.
It's there. And, you know, something I'm doing right now, and I've been doing it for a while, is because I'm slowly learning Spanish, I try to read something in Spanish to keep myself going. And I mean, the cheater's way for me, to be honest, is I put something on the Kindle, because then when I come to something that I can't understand, I can just touch it and understand it. And actually that's great, because it's like being a kid again, and I'm able to read way above my reading level, something that really is important to me. But I'm reading something right now which is also available in English translation, and I really recommend it. I'm slowly working my way through it in Spanish. It's called Cartucho by Nelly Campobello. And she, again, I mean, she's one of these not forgotten, but under-recognized women writers. So she was a Mexican. This is a memoir written from a girl child's point of view of the Mexican Revolution, which she lived through in the north of Mexico. And it's stunning, and it's really it's even in Spanish, I'm stunned by it, and it is available in English translation. And for me, it's a wonderful exercise to try and read in another language, because I think it does in some ways remind me of the wonder of reading that we experienced as a beginning reader, where you're just decoding and you're like, oh my gosh, it's all there. But I would recommend that.
Have you guys read Gina Frangello's Burn the House Down?
Yes.
I think that's the title of it. Have you, Ellen, have you read it, or Ginger?
I haven't read it yet.
I have
I
read it.
think
I mean, and I read all the controversy about it, and then I read it, and it's a really good book.
Oh,
and
it's
I
an
didn't
excellent book.
recognize the book in the review.
No,
The review in the New York Times from Danny Shapiro had no relationship to the book.
Yeah, but I'll tell you, somebody talked, I mean, she's a highly sexual individual, and this is a memoir, so we know that, you know, she's not writing as a fiction piece, but she's highly sexual, and she does not shy away from sharing her most intimate relationships. She explores her propensity towards kink. She explores she gives expression to herself as a woman in a way that I haven't read before, at least I haven't read recently. And it's admirable. I do highly recommend that book.
And it's not, one thing I noticed about it reminded me a little bit of the Sigrid Nunes, in that it's really voice driven. There's not a lot of scenes in it. Usually you expect memoir to be kind of scene driven, but it's really voice driven, and and her voice is so relentless, and you just can't let go of it.
Yeah.
I found myself staying up really late at night reading that book.
I've not
Well,
read
that was one of those books that
Marguerite Duras from your description, but we're ready to do readings. So I would love to have about a 5-minute reading from each of you. That would be wonderful.
Okay, well, I had mine is even shorter than that, but who would you like to read first, Ginger?
Why don't you go ahead and go since
Okay, so I want to read this little passage, which I've never read before, because I feel like it says something about kind of the origin of my becoming a memoirist. So it's just after my dad has told me that this man that I've often seen behind the counter at the post office has died. And he said, "This is your first death. You need to keep track of this." And then this comes after that. Even before Roy's death, my father had begun to instruct me in the marvels and burdens of memory. He was dressed in his usual outfit, jockey shorts, and in his favorite position on the living room sofa with an infant's splayed thighs and bent knees, 2 fingers poised over his eyebrow as if to physically trap the thoughts that moved too turbulently through his brain. "Deborah, wait." I startled and stopped. "Something about how you walked by me just now reminded me of myself one day when I was a child. It was an ordinary day just like this, and I was sitting in the kitchen of our apartment in Detroit. I decided to conduct an experiment. Could I will myself to remember a random moment? And out of the blue, that moment just came back to me, clear as a bell. You can do it too. You can will your memory." I wanted to be in on the experiment. "Okay, Daddy, show me," I said. "Look around the room, take everything in," he said. I panned the living room, the picture window that faced Teasley Street, the aqua walls, the deep green carpet, the red leather armchair, the open display shelves dividing the living room from the dining room. Their contents posed a challenge, all those figurines. My favorite, a painted ceramic squirrel that my mother brought down sometimes so I could touch him and then put back on a high shelf so I could not break him. "Okay, shut your eyes and make sure you've captured everything in the room," my daddy said. I concentrated. "Okay, now what?" "Say it along with me. Remember this moment. Remember this moment. If innocence is freedom from regret about the past and worry about the future, I was innocent still, residing like a dog in a perennial present tense. The future extended no further than the next meal, or the next day, or the next birthday, or some vaguely imagined day when I would be grown up. What my father said thrust me simultaneously forward into my future and back into my past, and then even further back to the time when my father was himself a child, a yaw of time before I existed. Just realizing that I had not been there made me queasy. Hadn't everything begun with me? Suddenly, I realized this moment, the very moment we were living, would soon be past, gone, lost. We were helpless to stop it. All we had was memory. "Remember this moment, remember this moment," I chanted along with him, beginning that day to tell the story of myself in my head. Thank you.
That was beautiful. Beautiful.
beginning to tell the story of myself in my head?
To claim yourself. I mean, that's often so much of what memoir is about, and yours definitely lives up to that, to authenticate yourself, to claim yourself, to give yourself license to be yourself. And you know, I've read your entire book. I've read it twice, and that passage I've already had underlined, honestly, because I thought this is the core. This is what this book is about.
Thank you.
I also really thought it was amazing the way you were inhabiting your young self, and, you know, looking around from that young self.
She's still here. I guess.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Well, you know what I'm reminded of, Ellen? I know you've talked before about how when you write, you'll sometimes close the door because you speak, you do the voices,
I do
right?
the voices, yeah. I mean, I don't mean to do the voices, but it just happens. Exactly. Yeah. You know, and it's funny because, of course, when I was doing therapy, the door would be closed so that it could be private for me and my client. And it's almost exactly the same thing, that when I'm writing, I need that privacy for me and the character. It's very similar. And I think, you know, it's for me as a writer, and maybe for all of us, you're listening for the voice. I mean, as Deborah was saying, what at least for me is most important in what I read is the voice. And it's important in what I write too. And I'm going to follow Deborah's choice of something she has not read before. And I haven't read this passage before, but my book, Frida's Song, is told in 3 voices. There's a voice, in a sense, from the past, which is Frida from Reichmann, who was a mid-century psychiatrist, German Jew refugee in the States. And then there's a voice of a current day therapist, Eliza, who rents what had been Frida's cottage. So she's living there in 2009. And then the third voice is the voice of Eliza's son, Nick. And Nick is about to turn 16 when the book takes place. And I'm going to read a very, very short passage that's a Nick passage. And really all you need to know is it's late at night and he's out. The sign for the pedestrian bridge across the train tracks was all lit up. The Peace Bridge, winner of the naming contest at school. The girl who thought it up stood near him in chorus. Pale but pretty, Jen. In a way, she was right. Crossing over from east to west Rockville was kind of like going over the Berlin Wall or the Rio Grande. One night, his mom was driving him to basketball practice in the community center over here. A cop stopped her. Nick was too little back then to know why. The cop thought she was shopping for crack. That would be the day, her shopping for crack. The bridge had a cage of wire, but someone with an assault rifle could do serious damage from up here. Like the sniper when he was in 4th grade, cruising around in an old green car, shooting people at gas stations, even a kid in a school parking lot. She drove him to school till they caught the man. She made him wear his seatbelt and sit on the seat, even though a bullet could come right in and he would have been safer hiding on the floor. Turned out the sniper had a kid with him, locked in the trunk, who did some of the shooting. The kid was in jail now too, for life. The guy wasn't his father. The bridge steps had no backs, like the cellar stairs at his grandparents' house. Their old house now, the kind of stairs you could slip through. Don't believe everything you think, Ma told him. But look at the people who got their feet trapped by shoelaces on Metro and had to have their legs amputated. Things happen.
Wow.
That was beautiful.
Wow.
That's
Wow,
Nick.
wow, wow. And especially given the conflict earlier in the book with Nick and his mother, that is, that really carries the reader into a deeper place with their relationship so poignantly.
One of the things I most appreciated about Nick's chapters, if I had only been seeing him from the outside, given the fact that he was cutting and he was burning and he was setting fires, I would have thought that he was so much more disturbed than he was, being able to see him from the inside. And then paralleling that with Frida's belief that compassion and love and listening could cure anyone, it made me believe it. It made me believe it for this modern day child, that this could be true for him. It was a beautiful idea to include his chapters. Yeah.
I'm worried about him. I'm at the point in the book where I'm still worried about him.
Well, I was still worried about him at the end, but I have such hope.
There's a lot to worry about, I think. I'm still worried about him, but you know, they're gone now, right?
Yeah. Well, let's see if we have any questions. We have no questions. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A and we can ask them now. Do we have any Yeah, if you have any questions, type them in the Q&A. I have a question. So there were a lot of discussions of craft, people that we have read for, voice or for time. Do you have any authors that you really would recommend, like not missing, books that you return to because of how they manage something so beautifully? I think of that one little passage into the lighthouse where several years are taken care of, in 15 or 20 pages. I reread that all the time when I'm thinking, when I feel stuck in time. So any aspect of craft.
I have to say I'm in Jane Eyre again. I go back to Jane Eyre for how do you handle the complexities of child mind? How do you really show respect for children and for children's thinking? Because I think that young Jane Eyre is an incredible character, incredibly strong, incredibly resilient, incredibly rebellious, not wanting to be what they're telling her. All the kind of gendered stories and the religious stories, everything they're telling her about who she has to be, she's not going to be any of those things. And I go back to those passages all the time when I'm thinking about how to write childhood.
I've never read Jane Eyre for that reason.
Oh, you have to read Jane Eyre.
Specifically, yeah, for that reason.
There is a question. It's in the chat, now the Q&A.
Well, let's see what Ellen says about.
Just quickly,
excuse me, yes.
What you just said, Deborah, really rings true for me too. And, immediately I think of William Maxwell and So Long, See You Tomorrow, which I could read, every other week of my life. And I think what he does, again, with inhabiting a very young man's point of view is something that it's both beautiful and it's also, I think, something that profoundly influenced me in terms of looking at, so how do you go about doing that? How do you get into the skin that way?
Without falling into caricature. I think I love your adolescent because he's not a caricature. And so many adolescents that you read in fiction do feel like caricatures, or do feel like they're just throwing in whatever the current jargon is so that it sounds authentic, but it doesn't feel like a real full-bodied human being. But your character does.
His
It's
ambiguous sexuality was fantastic.
So
Ellen.
many books who are talking about a particular, like a character like Nick, just fall on tropes. It's like, oh, he's the troubled boy. Oh, she's the helicopter mother. Oh, and what you did, you're the fiction writer amongst as well as Ginger, and neither of you, both of you could have done that, and neither of you did it in such a way that was so, I thought, very impressive.
And I think that goes, back to what we've all been talking about, that it doesn't matter whether it's fiction or nonfiction or poetry, so long as it's really authentic.
Yeah.
And I've just discovered a woman writer from the 1930s through 60s who I'm crazy about, and I just have to make sure people hear about her. Her name is Dorothy Whipple. I had never heard of her, but a friend gave me this little paperback catalog from London called the Persephone Biannual. And the Persephone Press, you can find them online. Their mission is to discover forgotten writers, women. And this Dorothy Whipple, talk about inhabiting child mind. I've just read one of her books. It's called Greenbanks. But she gets into the mind of a child just in an uncanny way. And now I'm reading a memoir of hers. So again, be prepared. It's British middle class life in the 1930s through 1960s, but she's brilliant.
Oh, thank you for that recommendation. And I love and for recommending Persephone Press as well.
Yeah,
What a mission.
I'm really happy with Persephone Press. I'm not getting a commission, Lord knows.
Right? So here's the question that came in from our panelists. Or from one of our participants, how can a memoirist tell their next story? Does one just go deeper into their past, some smaller experience rather than the over story?
What the book I'm working on now, although I'm a little superstitious to even talk about it, starts with my father's death and is basically during my 30s. It's a period in my 30s. So I mean, I think I mean, I don't know how long this person asking the question has lived, but you got a lot of material. I mean, I think you could write about who's that guy, Augustine Burroughs, who writes about like going up an escalator, and it's a whole book of just the experience of being on the
Yeah,
escalator.
yeah.
So you can take any one moment and expand it. I mean, it's not the experience, it's the way you write about it and the meaning you derive from it.
And I'm obviously not a memoirist, but I would just say, I just recently read a book that is called The Jane Austen Years by Rachel Cohen. And we've talked a lot about, Jane Austen and other people. But I love it. And it's a memoir, but it's interweaving her memoir about her relationship with her late father and her relationship with the books of Jane Austen. And for writers, it's a fascinating read.
Our H is for hawk, where it's the book about grieving and
Yeah.
raising a hawk,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So maybe you have a
so
second
intense.
story. Yeah.
So Ginger, do we have time? I do have a craft question, but maybe we need to just wind it up. Let me know.
It's 5:58.
Wind it up.
Let's just do the craft question real quick.
Okay.
Like
One
speed
thing-
dating, speed craft.
One thing that I really appreciate, because I think it's hard for me to do, is the structure that you both took was of a past voice and a current voice, and them alternating in chapters. And like I said, I think it's really brave. And I'm wondering if there are any books that you went back to look at to see how they did it, or if there are any books that you've read in the past that inspired you to do that.
I'm thinking. I didn't have a specific model, and I added the present day episodes pretty late in the game, where I just realized what I'm really interested in is also the way the past continues to resonate in adult lives. So I wanted to include that layer.
Mhm.
And I'd seen more writers doing more kind of mixed narrative, multiple narrative voices, multiple time periods, but I can't say there was one specific work that guided me. What about you, Ellen?
Well, I guess I would completely agree with you that I'm so interested in how the past continues to live on in us. Walls talk, there's friendly ghosts and unfriendly ghosts all around us and within us. And that's something that was true for me as I worked with clients, and it's true for me as a writer. But here's my Bible that probably started me down the path. I love, as a child, I loved the books by Mary Norton called The Borrowers. And The Borrowers, she wrote these books during World War II. And it's not by accident, I think, that she was writing about little tiny people under the floor, hiding from the evil people above. But what I love about these books is she uses the sandwich technique. And I think, again, I think I just inhaled it as a kid, and it's still with me, where in the very first book, she starts in the present moment. And then through that present moment narrator, an old woman, we slip back into the past. And I just love that.
Yeah.
And so I think that's part of the craft technique. Though I've also, Jody, had a lot of people say, oh, for heaven's sakes, just stick with the present or just stick with the past. But I love the fact that things in our own experience intermingle.
Truly. Thank you both for sharing that.
All right. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being our launch event. Thank you for everyone who is in attendance. Let's see, I hope you'll join us next July 28th. That's our next event, Wednesday, July 28th, 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern. We'll have a conversation with the American memoirist Emily Rapp Black and the Irish poet and memoirist Doireann Ní Ghríofa. Emily Rapp Black's most recent work is Frida Kahlo and My Left Leg, in which she examines how the experiences, art, and disabilities of Kahlo have shaped her own life as an amputee. And Doireann Ní Ghríofa's most recent work is A Ghost in the Throat. And this is her first prose work, and in it she tells the story of her own self-discovery as she works to give voice to 18th century poet Éireann Dubhney Hanel, also known as Eileen O'Connell. So I'll put the link to our events in the chat, and you can follow us on Instagram, or you can go to our website and you can sign up for our newsletter, and we will let you know what's coming next. Let's see. All right.
And
Thank you, Joe.
thank you,
Thank you so
everybody.
much.
You really have made us, to jump into something like this takes a tremendous amount of detail and confidence that both of us were like, I'm down and Ginger was up, and Ginger was down and I was up. And our partnership has grown even stronger through this. We are friends. We met at the Bennington Writing Seminars. We both graduated in 2010. And so it's been a sustaining writing and literature relationship that has actually developed into a very close friendship. And this is something that, we both wanted to do, but how to do it a little bit differently, not just talk, read, as I said earlier, not just read from what you've written, but talk about the books that have influenced you. And thank you so much, Ellen and Deborah. You just jumped in
Thank you.
four feet.
We're so
you.
lucky to have a chance to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Take care.